You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
We're talking today about the security of healthcare and medical records. And in the words of old-time radio and television personalities, I hasten to urge you to not touch that dial and click over to something on Spotify. In older living memories, the topic of medical records likely conjures up images of large rooms filled with files bursting with pieces of paper, the contents of which would not likely attract much interest except from reporters nosing out anything about the health and well-being of political candidates or attorneys in the midst of malpractice suits. Today's ransomware and the associated concern for unauthorized access to and the confidentiality of health records would not be a topic of interest, since only one or two persons, most likely nurses and pharmacists, could read the handwritten notes of physicians. But don't touch those dials. Electronic health information is the visible 1/6 of an iceberg of change coming about in medicine and healthcare, due in part to the increasing availability of information about virtually every aspect of healthcare. What began in the 1960s, primarily at academic medical centers, was spurred by the attractiveness of harnessing computers as tools by which the practice of medicine and the delivery of care could be improved by reducing medical errors. But computers were expensive, were not especially fast or reliable, and did not appear likely to produce substantial financial benefit if implemented on a large scale. Physicians at that time viewed computers as threatening the autonomy of their profession, and they were dubious that information systems would improve what they saw as the highly idiosyncratic decisions doctors made. But there was a sort of inevitability to the transfer of medical records to electronic form. The sheer volume of information generated by the diagnosis and treatment of disease and injury, provision and use of supplies, materials, and devices, the scheduling of procedures to be performed, differentiated fees and compensation for care providers, the use of controlled substances, protocol adherence, and on, made healthcare ripe for digitization. Then the establishment of Medicaid and Medicare and the expansion of both, access to care and the role of the federal government, carried with them the necessity of better ways of keeping track of the flows of people, money, and activities. The capacity of the United States to pay the cost of transformation of healthcare information into data was countered somewhat by ever-growing doubts about just how much could and should be spent on healthcare, and where in the system costs were increasing fastest. But both factors still contributed to bolster the case for digitizing information. Features of the American system of medical and healthcare itself, multiple payers for services, increased specialization, and more referrals among physicians, compliance requirements and standards, all of these and other factors hasten the computerization of information in medicine and healthcare. Then, with the advent of the internet, the possibility of linking databases and computer systems made possible data exchanges, multiple users with greater access to more kinds of information, mobile and digital medical devices communicating wirelessly, cloud storage and processing, and a welter of other capabilities to connect and interconnect patients, physicians, and other caregivers, as well as research, administrative, and financial entities. The Norman Rockwell paintings of the kindly town doctor are the stuff of nostalgia, now replaced by doctors and nurses with iPads and access to a lifetime of medical and health information about a patient who has lived in various parts of the country and changed doctors 4, 5, maybe 6 times, and for the past 18 months, visited the doctor virtually. It is a different world. We have the good fortune of having with us someone who has intimate knowledge of the workings of health information systems and spends his days tending to the security of the health information of thousands of people. Jonathan Jack Kufahl is the Chief Information Security Officer for Michigan Health, the academic medical enterprise of patient care, education, and research of the University of Michigan. An alumnus of Illinois State University, Kufahl began his career at the University of Michigan as IT manager for biological chemistry in the School of Medicine and rose through a series of successive expansions of responsibility and expertise. The state of Michigan recognized Jack's capabilities in making him Commissioner of Health Information Technology for the Department of Health and Human Services. His leadership extended to serving as founding incorporating officer, board chair, and president of the Michigan Healthcare Cybersecurity Council, a public-private partnership to safeguard critical healthcare and infrastructure in Michigan. And I have it on good authority that when Jack is not working at being CISO, he likes to spend time in the northern parts of Michigan. But it's not clear whether even in the wild, he is ever off the grid and away from his work. Welcome to Innovators. Medicine at the University of Michigan dates back to 1848, when the medical school was made a full part of the university, with physicians as faculty, first in the United States. But that was the first of many firsts at Ann Arbor, including the 1997 approval of the name University of Michigan Health System to encompass the several university hospitals, health center, medical school, M-Care, and the Michigan Health Corporation. Then the School of Nursing also came under that designation in 2008. In 2012, the first phase of a comprehensive electronic health information system known as MyCare went online and enabled a web-based patient portal. In 2019, the name Michigan Medical debuted as the designation for the entire university academic medical enterprise, combining patient care, education, and research. So I have three queries I'd like to begin with, if I may, Jack. What parts of that complex world are you responsible for as Chief Information Security Officer? How does that role compare with the role of a CISO at a standalone hospital, one that's not directly connected with a medical school? And you have a role outside the university with the state of Michigan. What is that role and how does it relate to your primary duties?
Sure. Thanks, Rick, for having me. The Academic Medical Center at the University of Michigan has squishy borders. So primarily, I spend my time being the CISO for the hospitals, the medical group, which is our ambulatory and our clinics out and around the region, the medical school. And the medical school has both the education and learning portion of it, as well as the research component. So those are the three large pillars that I spend my time with. And that in itself is also one of the big differences between, say, I shouldn't say just, but a standalone hospital. So I work with a lot of peers inside the state of Michigan, and there's big hospitals and there's small hospitals. I would say the University of Michigan hospital is, mid to large, about 1,000 beds or so. But there's hospitals that are, 4, 5, 6,000 beds inside the state of Michigan. So it's not necessarily that my job is harder, but it does mean that I have to take different approaches than maybe a more contemporary clinical hospital CISO, and we don't necessarily have the same approach or the same expectations. And that makes it sometimes challenging, but really quite a bit more interesting because we have to spend a lot of time on the human factor. You mentioned in your intro that the hospital is faculty-led, which is also how we design most of our administrative programs, because the faculty are incredibly involved. They act as our advisors and our coaches and our mentors, and ultimately as our governance for how we progress the institution forward.
What about the role that you have with the state of Michigan?
That was a unique opportunity. I was appointed as a commissioner for the Health Information Technology Committee, which is a oversight group for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And what that group does is largely focusing on the oversight of health information exchanges. So there's representatives from all different parts of the sector, and I sit on that as the commissioner representing hospitals. That helps shape different strategies for how the state supports health information exchanges and then working with the major HIEs within the state.
How has that stretched your kind of expertise? It seems to me that's a fairly complex mix.
It is, but I think that what brings it home to me is that I would say contemporary information security really has to be about data protection and appropriate data use. I think it's becoming less about networks and firewalls and things of that nature, really concrete security things. It's much more about data and how the data flows and how the data uses and how the data is allowed and protected and allowed to be used outside of just the normal patient-physician environment, but really further out for research and collaboration.
I found myself reading a U.S. Department of Health and Human Services document, and it had the portentous title of Reassessing Your Security Practices in a Health IT Environment. And while the document's targeted to small healthcare practices, it seemed to me to speak to the whole array of organizations that are involved in healthcare delivery. So allow me to quote at some length from the document. It starts by saying information security is the protection of information and information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction. Information security is achieved by ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. It goes on to define those three properties in the following terms. Confidentiality is the property of that electronic health information that is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized persons or processes. Pretty straightforward. Integrity, the property that electronic health information has not been altered or destroyed in an unauthorized manner. And then availability, the property that electronic health information is accessible and usable upon demand by an authorized person. And as you just alluded to, the number of authorized persons seems to be growing all the time. So it strikes me that while those three properties are probably undeniably essential, there's some inherent tension among them that makes security all the more problematic. And the obvious one is availability. The more you expand data availability, it seems to me, the more at risk is your confidentiality, and for that matter, the integrity. Is that part of what appears to be sort of an inherent and increasing dilemma for anyone charged with health information security?
I think I wouldn't necessarily represent it as a dilemma. There is a tension. I think it's a productive tension between those three areas of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. What I mean by that is when you read documents of that nature, and that's a pretty common, we call it the CIA, the CIA inside of information security. It doesn't necessarily say that those are all in perfect ratio or in perfect balance.
Touché.
And I think that a lot of that depends on the culture of your organization or the sector that you're in. So for the healthcare sector and the idea of keeping a 24/7, highly available, high occupancy hospital around, that there are challenges and there are expectations beyond every IT system being up and running 24/7. There's a priority and there's an understanding. And I think that really speaks more to availability, right? I think that when we look at availability, that's really the richest, deepest problem to diagnose and pull apart, because hospitals, but academic medical centers in particular, are extraordinarily complex. They're renowned for being complex. I've often heard it phrased that, academic medicine is all the complexities of healthcare with all the complexities of academia operating at once. And that's either terrifying or really, really exciting. So I tend to focus on availability, not to the exclusion of integrity or confidentiality, but also in our culture. I would say this is probably similar in a lot of hospital cultures. Confidentiality and HIPAA regulation has been around longer than sort of the burning platform of information security. And most hospitals, by one way or another, have got mature confidentiality and regulatory agency. Healthcare is rife with and rightfully so. But availability, and particularly availability now that the sector is under increased attack, tends to be the area that some open secrets inside of healthcare are starting to impact. Open secrets like what we'll often call inside of IT the lifecycle problem. Hospitals are running on 20 years of the latest technologies all networked together. And hospitals are generally built, for 30 to 50 years, the physical buildings. The equipment is expensive and the medical devices are expensive and the people to run them and train them are expensive. And it's a large living system. It's almost better to anthropomorphize a hospital than to think of it as a company. because you really have to understand how it's going to behave and how it's going to react. So keeping the place running almost is the paramount concern. And the impact of, say, proactively removing availability of some technical system because of cybersecurity attack or perceived cybersecurity event is a weighty decision. And that means you need to have really close relationships. And again, that human factor with leaders and organizations and teams far outside of IT and far outside of cybersecurity. And I think that's one of the next big steps. To that point, we talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but in healthcare, I'm seeing more and more, and I support this, that we're adding to that CIA PS for patient safety, as medical devices and patient movement systems and integrity of data becomes critically important, that the patient safety factor and how cybersecurity impacts it is going to be as equal as availability, integrity, and confidentiality, if it isn't already there very soon.
Jet, would it be too strong to say that the question now of availability is really becomes a second order technical question, because it's a much broader conceptual issue now, given the kind of availability we're talking about? Is that too strong?
No, I think that's appropriate. And I also think that, the complexities are only increasing. And I think in a lot of other sectors, certainly not all, but in a lot of other sectors, the availability and the complexity is getting easy with some IT trends and market trends like cloud, right? Inside of healthcare, I would say it's a net positive to move things to the cloud. And I think for a security point of view, it's a net positive for security. But it's going to be a difficult transition because we're going to be living in this interconnected legacy and next generation world, which is going to stretch availability because you start becoming dependent on so many other things. And there's been all sorts of different service outages that have impacted large swathes of the country. And those are cloud outages. I'm thinking back a couple of years, there was a type of configuration error attack. I forget which one it was, but Netflix wasn't available for the Eastern Seaboard for some period of time. Not a big deal, right? But that's an example of a cloud service that's being interrupted. And now what happens if you become so dependent on a link in your availability in the cloud that you then can't move or transmit radiology images, right? So those are the types of availability factors we have to start becoming cognizant of. It used to be that availability on a sort of siloed, circa 1999 hospital was about power or cooling or physical disaster or labor. And those things are all still very true. We have to start factoring in the packets and the information flow and how data gets from point A to point B, not only in the speed that it needs to get there and in the expected way, but also with that confidentiality, integrity, and regulatory need as well.
Yeah, that's a great transition to what I want to ask you about now. As we're talking, Congress is still weighing a very large investment in the nation's physical infrastructure. Nowhere, to my knowledge, is the resilience or security of health information systems, maybe except for government information systems. Nowhere is that mentioned, meaning, I suppose, that hospital and other healthcare entities will continue to bear the responsibility for maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information they manage. But let's just imagine for a moment that you were advising your congressional representatives. What would you recommend with respect to investing in the security of health information systems? And let me because I just nuance that a little bit. What I mean by that is, if you're going to make some kind of investments, where should those investments be in a health information system now?
Sure, it's an interesting question. And I've spoken to a couple representatives, about this in different roles and different capacities. And I think that if we were to sit back and expect a federal government response to this particular problem, one, we'd probably be waiting longer than the problem deserves. And that's not a insult to Washington. It's a slow inefficient organism, the US government. It's supposed to be, it was designed that way. And the other thing is, I think a lot of people look to the government as a penultimate authority to solve big problems, and it isn't necessarily true. America's a naturally entrepreneurial country. And I think in that there's that balance and there's that expectation about how do, in our case, in the sector, the health delivery organizations partner, not expect and not wag a finger, but partner with the regulators, the different administrative agencies and Congress, if should be, but then also the manufacturers. And looking at the medical device industry in particular, which has seen a rapid growth, not just in how they become digital and integrated, but also in the market that's opening up with home health and home care. You were just going to see an explosion of sensors, medical and wellness sensors. And I think that's a good thing. I think more data is a good thing, and having patient-generated data as part of the medical record is a good thing. I don't exactly know how all the pieces are going to fit together yet, but I know that that's sort of that next big push. And again, it's about the data, not really about the device. It's really about the data. And so that's really where the partnership and the expectation should be around, is I think that if there are to be regulations, or if there is to be guidance, it should be clear, it should be in partnership with the manufacturers. And if it is to be some sort of investment and funding structure, it may be in standards for about how data flows, or standards about how data is formatted. Because one of the issues with technology in general, but medical technology and healthcare technologies, is just the vast diversity of how some technology is built, or devices manufactured, or data is formatted. And that takes extraordinary resource. Resources are thin in general. And it also leads to quite a bit of error. And unfortunately, it means that a lot of data goes fallow and maybe doesn't necessarily get used. So the whole point of having medical information data is to use those data to create knowledge about how to extend human life, whether it's the human life that's in the bed right now or the human life that's going to be in the bed 40 years from now. So all that has to be curated. And that's something that weighs on me at an academic medical center, is we're responsible for the curation of extraordinary amounts of data, not just for immediate needs, but for whatever those future needs are.
Can I ask you follow up a little bit on that? It strikes me that it sounds as though you would advocate to your congressional representatives in this hypothetical role, or not so hypothetical as you've talked to them, but the emergence of standards out of the stakeholders themselves, as opposed to an imposition of standards from, say, a central government. It sounds to me as though you have a great deal of faith in the ability of the community, if you will, to come together ultimately, partly out of self-interest, but also because in the end, that's probably the best way we're going to have good care for everybody, as opposed to someone saying, well, this is the way it's going to have to be, and you're going to have to design your devices and your systems to fit these standards. Is that too strong?
No, I think that's spot on. And I think that the analog to this is, and I don't know the entire history, so I'm speaking a little bit out of school, is sort of the maturation of financial industry and things like credit card standards, where the major corporations had a compelling interest to determine some standards for themselves. Now, I'm sure there's pluses and minuses to that, but the point of the analogy is that they were industry-led standards that were then facilitated, adopted, endorsed, compelled through government agency guidance or statute. If we were to start mixing technical, nitty-gritty, nerdy details inside statute, boy, it's going to be wrong by the time it's signed. So it's really about how do you incentivize industry to create those standards, multiple standards, no doubt, and assist them in the coordination and the collaboration. The government's good at incentivizing. The government's good at the collaboration. It's good at grant funding. These are things that it's very, very good at. It would be fool's errand to have the government implement a technical standard that they don't have the expertise to understand.
Touche. Now, we mentioned something earlier about your past always comes back to haunt you. Well, here's a case of it. Back in 2017, you wrote a commentary in Modern Healthcare, and you joined with three very now they're very high-ranking leaders in healthcare information. And you made the argument that the means and insight for assuring the security of medical devices and the information those devices produce, those were already at hand if hospitals and their entities collaborated with one another to use and establish standards for such devices and their security, just what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because the article closed with what I found to be an uncharacteristically blunt statement. They said, what is now required to enhance cybersecurity is the healthcare community's commitment and fortitude to just do it. That article was prompted by reports associated with a hospital's failure to disclose that pacemakers implanted in patients and other cardiac devices were known to be defective. Now, 4 years later, see, I told you your past would come back.
Yep.
Would you stick with the contention that it's just a matter of hospitals just doing it? Or, by contrast, has the lack of national standards in a central testing facility, has that been solved by now?
That problem has not been solved, but it has improved. And I would say that I do stand by that. I think that inside healthcare cybersecurity, there's a lot of standing around and admiring the problem. And the medical device security problem is significant for all those things we've talked about. Great diversity, long-time funding, systems going from being industrial grade systems to being consumer grade systems and entering the household, data flows, data package, all these different things. Some of those medical device systems are frail. They're just a frail system, and they're destined for high availability needs. There's a direct correlation between how well a patient monitoring system may work. Systems that are at the bedside, and any modern hospital you go into, you see nurses stations where you've got 10 rooms up on a screen where you're seeing the heartbeat and the blood ox and all those types of things, because that's a more efficient way of addressing patient monitoring and alarming than twice as many nurses or twice as many medical assistants or whatever the case may be. So they're doing their jobs, and the systems of hospitals become extraordinarily dependent on them, which means availability is a big issue. So we've got the perfect storm of all these complexities, and you can sit back and you could admire that. I heard from a major medical device manufacturer that it takes about 10 years for a medical device to go from basically the chalkboard to the patient's bedside. So that
a decade.
Yeah. So it can take a long time for some of these systems in a manufacturing way to get from point A to point B. So you're dealing with these big cycles of time. So it's not necessarily reasonable to wait for it to get better. You're going to be waiting, right? Because it's the legacy and the life cycle problem. So you have to start working on it. It doesn't mean that you have to be a jerk about it. Like I said, it's really all about partnership, and there is opportunity there. And then there's good models now. You mentioned Mayo Clinic earlier. Mayo Clinic is in my opinion, the national leader in how an institution can develop and progress a cybersecurity medical device program without destroying the medical device program of the institution at the same time. But I mean, it takes years to build up, and it is steady increment. It's a go slow to go fast sort of methodology. And that's partnering with your manufacturers, your procurement departments, your physician groups, your chief medical information officers, and being committed and just doing it to saying, look, I don't know if we can make this good, but we can definitely make it better. Right. And taking those opportunities as they come will make a more secure medical device environment. And it's not going to be something that one silver bullet vendor is going to come out of the blue and fix for any hospital. It takes the institution to change and to work on that and to find room for it. And I think the strongest ally there is going to be with with atypical partners to the chief information security officer, your chief patient safety officer, your chief medical officer, your chief procurement or supply chain officer, your chief facilities officer. These are the types of folks that can really help and really do want you to be successful in securing these items because they know more than others about how dependent a facility is, and therefore how patient care is impacted if they're not available. And that helps create drivers and expectations of not just the security and how a network is configured or how a system may be used or how data may flows, but how you write the contract for the next MRI, or how you encourage different glucometers to be used in a particular way. And so I do see the market responding. 5 years ago, was the market responding very well? No, it was all very, empty promises. But now there's significant movement, and I see medical device vendors using as their differentiating factor how they approach cybersecurity. So it's getting there.
That has changed.
That has changed. So it is still just a matter of hospitals saying this is a priority. Amongst all our other priorities, this is a priority too, and we have to make room for it.
Just out of curiosity, Jack, I still go back to something you said earlier, that there are devices that have been out there on hospital floors for, in some cases, 20 years still.
Sure.
So you're talking about a vintage that was as long as 20 years ago, but it's going to take 10 years to get the replacement for that off the chalkboard into production before it's going to get into a hospital again. So we're talking about really almost a 30-year cycle of updating. So it not only has to be a priority, it has to have some degree of urgency attached to it.
Yeah. It's a career issue, right? Now I would say that 30 years is an extraordinary example.
Yes,
I would say, medical equipment is, for example, here's an area that we're seeing an emergence of digitization is in the beds themselves. The beds act as a sensor. The beds act as a bridge for patient comfort, for patient wellness. So it's more than a gurney and a mattress, right? Now, hospitals are rarely going to say, we're going to take these perfectly good legacy beds and toss them out. Right? Hospitals have to prioritize everything, right? Cybersecurity, beds, personnel, staff, air conditioning units, all that sort of stuff. So once something has reached its sort of useful duty cycle, there's going to be a whole market, and there is a whole market of whatever that next generation is. So it's not necessarily that these things work linearly. There's a constant stress of systems being digitized and upgraded, from the beds to robots that work in pharmacies to surgical robots to camera systems to how valuables are tracked and kept for patients that are coming in through the ED, and then at the end of the day the EHR, electronic health record. So everything's moving full speed. So there isn't much waiting around, but it's just to say that if you were to wait for that prime opportunity to start improving something, you're just going to be waiting the entire time, It
reminds me of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. I always remind Godot never showed up. So,
so it's about, having the principles, and then building the plan around those principles as the opportunities arrive to improve, right? So you're always chasing. I usually say it's like a differential equation. It's always approaching zero, but you never get to zero, right? So it's like you're always approaching plutonic cybersecurity inside a hospital, but you're never going to get there, right? But you have to keep going. Otherwise you fall into a maintenance mode. And I think you lose. I think that's how you lose.
Last question. I want to talk a little bit about who becomes a security officer at an organization that's in some way comparable to Michigan Health. And there may not be lots of those, but for the moment, let's just dwell on that. I'd like you to reflect on your friends and colleagues who serve in positions similar to the one you hold. And at the risk of doing injustice to any one of them or you, how would you characterize the attributes that help them get to those roles? Are there one or two that really stick out?
Yes. And there's all sorts of good reasons why a CISO is successful or CISO isn't successful. And it usually rarely has to do with what I'll call hard technical skills. In fact, I don't think I have any hard technical skills anymore. I think that those days have left me.
You're not going to get my printer to work?
I'm not going to get your printer to work, but if you need me to be able to cut and cap a Cat3 cable, I can still probably do that. I don't know if it's going to be useful for anything, but I can do that.
I don't use those around the house very much.
The areas where I see a CISO failing. And I'll just classify very simply CISO failure as CISO burnout, which is what I see more than anything else. The chemistry that they have with their peers and their leaders. And I think I said, if you're going to have a skill set, I've heard it, colloquially referred to as how do you manage up? And I think a lot of times that means how do you manage the person signing your timesheet? And I actually think it's how do you manage up to all those people, right? All those different leaders that have a piece of this equation. And hospitals, and especially academic medical centers, are thick with leaders. They're very complex, and in some hospitals, you have a VP type structure. Well, we have VPs, and on some health systems you have deans and assistant deans, and associate deans, and seniors. Well, we're medical school. We've got that structure. Then you've got all the culture and hierarchy of just being a faculty physician-led organization. So a lot of times people are concerned about, well, who's the CISO report to? And that's going to indicate whether they're successful. There's a school of thought, behind that. I don't put much into it because of my environment. I report to a CIO, I report to a great CIO, a physician CIO, former CMIO, lots of context, lots of partnership. Mm-hmm. I'd be just as successful reporting to a chief operating officer or a chief compliance officer or a chief legal officer. I don't think that's because they're all different types of people. Mm-hmm. It's a question about what you want to accomplish. The point is, all those people are part of this leadership team that I'm also a part of. So the next CISO needs to be able to abstract and think about the organization that they work for, not the person they report to. And that's a difficult challenge. Usually I say there's two types of people: the people that work for their boss or people that work for their institution. You can be successful at either one, but that mentality is going to tell you about how successful you're going to be getting a thing done, a complicated thing. Medical device security is a good example, right? That's complicated. And if you just depend on convincing the person who signs your paycheck, your boss, you're not going to be successful, in my opinion, right? You're going to, the next CISO has to be this chief storyteller more than a chief information security officer or chief translator or somebody that understands the context of an institution, not just the bottom line of an institution. And that's key, in my opinion. Now that's a bit fluffy, but you can expect that because we're a university. But I see more success with that model of CISO, not just with their individual careers, but how they're able to take whatever the maturity of their cybersecurity program is at whatever institution they're at and take it to whatever the appropriate next step is, whether that's an inch more of maturity or a yard more of maturity. The point is you have to constantly be maturing. There's no resting in cybersecurity, which means you need all those people to understand what you're trying to accomplish and understand that they're a part of that. And that's where I spend all my time is in those relationships, because without those relationships, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. You're in your 19th year?
19th year at the University of Michigan. I started out there as a temp, actually. So 20 years by my count, but 19 years according to HR. Yeah.
All of it in the School of Medicine in one way or another.
Yep.
How does your career path and your profile as a CISO compare with those of your peers, other than your better looks, more charm, and a saintly demeanor? I mean, other than that, how do you differ from them?
I think that's pretty much due to, and I'll put in the shameless promotion for the University of Michigan there, because you're not allowed to talk about the University of Michigan without shameless promotion of the University of Michigan. It's a great place to work. It is a place where somebody out of college like myself can come in, they can put in really hard days, really keep at it. But I usually say this in the interview process where people that are choosing whether to stay or not in the academic, because universities aren't the top payers in the market. They're good payers, right? They're better than average payers. They're not the top payers. Like, you can make more money working as a CISO, particularly in finance or insurance or hedge funds. You can make big bucks there. But the institution for me is really what that career is. And I think I use the word institution more than company. I get a lot of pride out of working for the University of Michigan because it allows me to contribute. And I don't think that's all that common. I think you work for a company and you can do good work and you can be a valuable team member, but are you allowed to contribute and in whatever small way, add your thought, your intelligence, and your energy to make it better? So I think that's unique. So I don't see too many people outside of academia working for the same place for that many years. That being said, it is really common at universities to see people retiring with 45 years under their belt. So it speaks to that it engenders itself to that type of person. And I think that explains my story a little bit. Is one, it's allowable. It's part of our culture. The university invested in me, and I invested in the university, and plenty of failures. I will also say the universities tend to be very forgiving, right? And that helps. And that's my story, right? I've heard it referred to as a Mustang career, right? You start out and you build up over time, but I'm not the only one.
All right, you go home one night and you confess to your better half that it's time for you to get on the sailboat and do the South Pacific run. And now they got to fill your job. You've been around almost a generation, Jack. Come on now. It's, you've been around so long that you actually have to do the United Way campaign every year. So you've been around. So somebody's going to be, I hate to say this, a little younger than you are, okay?
Mm-hmm.
What, by virtue of that generational difference, are they going to bring to the job that you have, as complex as it is? What will they bring that will be different? Not necessarily better, different.
Right. What I will go that step. I think it will be better, at least for who replaces me. And I think that's because, and I've experienced it myself, but there's also a lot of good research out there that the millennial and younger generations are far more compelled by mission and purpose for personal fulfillment than salary promotion. And I think that's critical inside cybersecurity, particularly for an institution like a healthcare institution or a university. So the thing about that is it also requires a great deal of patience and a great deal of ability to build teams. I would say the expectation on my generations just older than mine was that you really had to get good at everything. You had to be a good IT leader. You had to be a good HR leader. You had to be a good. And I think that if you can build your expectations more about, no, you actually need a team, and where you have strengths, we should monopolize those strengths. We should build on those strengths. And where you have weaknesses, we should partner with people that have those weaknesses. And I think that's, as you build those teams, I firmly believe that, my team's about 60 people large. And there are people 20 years younger than me, and there's people 20 years older than me. And making the assumption that whoever the next CISO is, it could be somebody that currently works for me, which sometimes happens. I see, a dozen possibilities in there, because it's about teaching those principles, and it's about teaching that balance, and it's about teaching that patience. Sometimes I have spectacular failures at those, but then, having those behaviors to call out and say, oh, no, this is actually what you need. I think that's really what's going to happen next. I think the era of sort of the dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore networking becomes CISO is, I think we're kind of done with that. I have vast appreciation for that. And perhaps my perspective is a little skewed because I'm not that. But I think that the CISOs really have to be in that leadership role as part of that leadership team, not leading technology change, but leading practice and principles and risk change. The technology will change, and some of it will sort itself out, and some of it will get worse. But it's really about the behaviors and the rituals and the culture of an organization to understand how you can help it. And I think whoever comes next is going to be able to do that inherently better, because I had to learn all those things. But I think that the millennial or younger generations have that a little bit more closer to their heart already, and are willing to put so much of themselves into the organization that learning the security piece is actually the easy part.
Don't plan on shipping out anytime soon, okay?
Well, and I'm not heading to the South Pacific.
I'm sorry.
Western UP for me. I'll
checked out all the sailboats in Ann Arbor. You're not going. Jack, thank you very, very much for joining us on Innovators, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.